Welcome to the presentation on best practices for job seekers. These are ideas that for the most part aren't covered on our books, but I've found students ask a lot of questions about these, or these are issues that I see come up on a lot of resumes and cover letters. So I want to address them. I also include some information that just comes from my experience in helping students with their resumes, and also from talking to prospective employers about what they look for in job applicants and some things that you can do to make your chances even better for getting jobs. As you're working on your resume and cover letter, remember that these aren't just two pieces of paper that exist for employers to look at. Remember that the idea behind these is to get you in the door to get an interview. And there are some other things that go along with that. In addition, technology has really made things more complicated for job seekers in the last 10 to 20 years. And you'll often find advice about these things here and there, but they're not really in our textbooks yet. I feel like they're important. The main thing you want to remember is professionalism. And this is a way of acting not just in the way that you write up your papers. That's very important, and that's what you're graded on in this assignment. But an overall professional approach to the way that you go about things. When we here at Ancilla College have talked to local employers about what they're looking for, what can we do as a college to help our students be better employees and get better jobs and fit the descriptions that these employers are looking for, one of the main things that comes up repeatedly is just the ability to follow directions. And yes, good employees need to have initiative. They need to show up on time. That's a big one that employers also talk about. They need to be able to have independent and critical thinking. We focus on that a lot at Ancilla College. But critical thinkers, independent thinkers are great, but your creativity will only be good so long as you're able to also apply that to following directions and doing what your boss asks you to do. So when you're writing resumes and cover letters, pay very specific attention to the way that they're supposed to be done and what employers want. If employers want you to attach a document, attach a document. If they want it submitted through an online website, then submit it that way. Make sure that you're showing them that you know how to follow directions. This seems like common sense, but when you send in a resume or a cover letter, or even just pass out a generic resume and cover letter at a job fairs, the whole point is to get employers to contact you and say, hey, we want to bring you in for an interview. And that seems like I'm stating the obvious, but it's leading to this idea that the contact information you provide needs to be professional. It seems like this would be common sense, but employers have told me, and I've seen in my own experience being on hiring committees and working jobs that included hiring people, that sometimes people, especially younger college students, don't think about the contact information that they put on their resume and cover letter, and that can really blow it. Someone who looks like he or she might be fairly qualified or could be a decent candidate can really blow it by not putting professional contact information or doing other things that are simply unprofessional, and really the company doesn't want to be associated with that. So this is going to sound really funny, but this comes from, again, my personal experience and talking with other people who have been in employment and things that they've seen. When you are sending in your resume, and if your email address that you list on the resume and on the cover letter as being your primary email address, if that is sexymama69@hotmail.com or heydude420 or something, referencing sex or drugs or alcohol, or even just very casual, can be really off-putting to employers. They think that you don't take yourself seriously because you're putting that on the resume. I'm not here to judge whatever you do in your own private time, but the reality is that if you put that on a resume, you're going to be looked down on. So you need to, if you haven't before, you need to create a free email account, a Gmail or Hotmail or something, that has basically just your name or some form of your name. You could use your Ancilla email address. I know you won't have that same email address after you graduate. After a while, you won't have access to that email address anymore, most likely. So be careful about changing it if you do use it on resumes right now. But you won't want to be handing out resumes or sending in resumes with some kind of obscure email address, even if it isn't something sex, drug, alcohol, whatever related. If it's something that's like an inside joke or just doesn't make sense or could be just seen as gobbledygook, again, you want to present yourself well. So even if it's not offensive, you want to be, on the safe side and make sure that it's professional. That also applies to your voicemail. And I know we all like to have really fun voicemail greetings with people, that when people call our number, we do cute little things like pretending we're still saying hello, hello, hello over and over again, mimicking the voice of some movie star or playing loud music or just saying, hey dude, what's up? Things like that. And again, whatever, I understand we're all kind of casual sometimes and we all like to have fun. But if you are going to have employers calling you and leaving a voicemail about when to come in for an interview, you want to make sure that you set up your voicemail in such a way that it sounds professional. It doesn't need to sound stuffy. It doesn't need to sound, like you're trying to work in an office right then, but just something very simple so that when they call, they're not getting confused or again, think of somebody in their 50s or 60s calling you from a professional office job, and when they listen to your voicemail, they may not think it's cool like your friends who are 18 and 19 will think it's cool. They're going to think you're an idiot, and they're going to change their mind about bringing you in, or they're going to have that prejudice against you when they go to bring it in. So you want to be really careful about that. When you go on a job search too, that's a good time to go back and look over your social media, that meaning Facebook or Twitter, things like that. Employers often do seek these things out when they've decided that they are interested in a candidate. So even though we talked in previous lessons and presentations about how they're only going to look for 6 seconds at your resume to see if you're a good fit, if they do think you're a good fit, they'll put it in a pile and go back and look over it more carefully. And if they're still interested in you, many employers will go back and look through social media. They'll look you up on Facebook. They'll look for an old MySpace page. They'll look through Twitter. They'll look for other things. They'll do a Google search on you. And you want to make sure that as much as you can control what you allow people to see, that you've got something good there rather than something trashy or something that just doesn't represent yourself well. You might want to change your privacy controls on Facebook so that people either really can't see it, or you'll want to make sure that you don't have any photos up that would show you engaged in any behavior that, whether it's legal or acceptable or appropriate for your age or not, it may not be something that the company wants to see. So those pictures of you with the beer bottles, or the pictures of you smooching your girlfriend or boyfriend, or the pictures of you at the beach, again, those are things that are all fine and good for your friends to see, and we all like to have a good time, and social media is great. But you want to make sure that you don't have those things up for prospective employers to see. And in some cases, it could be detrimental to your getting that job. We talked about some sensationalistic things, like, again, the pictures that you put up. But even if your Facebook wall is full of you saying things that sound really uneducated or controversial or just full of filthy language between you and your friends, again, I'm not here to judge that. I really don't care what you do, what you say on those things, because that's your business. As an instructor, my job is not to teach you how to use Facebook in a way that I think would be appropriate. But you do want to keep in mind that your employer isn't going to want to see that. And again, perhaps the person who is thinking about hiring you voted a certain way or has certain values or beliefs. If that person is looking through the Facebook, or if that person has employees looking at your Facebook or Twitter, and you're getting really argumentative, you're posting things that aren't well researched, you're, again, showing things that aren't true to their values, whether it's legal or not, whether you think it's fair or not, those people can judge you based on that, and you may not get a job. So be very careful about what you post, and be very careful about who can see what you post. The helpful thing about social media is that you can actually use that to research your employer. And I'm not talking about, figuring out who's going to interview and researching that person and what his or her interests are. I mean, if you want to do that and be kind of sneaky, that can be fun. You can pretend you're a spy or something. But what I'm talking about is that's a good way to research the company and look through the company's websites. Whenever you're going to apply to a company, and especially if a company wants to bring you into an interview, you should be looking through the website to find out what their values are, and what that company stands for, what that company's history is, who some of the people are that might be working for or working with, you should go into an interview and go into an experience even applying for a job knowing some of these things as much as possible. So keep an eye on the company's social media, keep an eye on the company websites, and that way you can even show them that you do know about their latest product or you do know about some new idea that they're talking about. So those are some nice ideas and positive ways to use social media, not just staying away from the negative. The last thing that you want to remember throughout this process is the idea about follow. And we'll talk more about follow-up communication in a couple of minutes. But again, on the same vein as what we've been talking about here, you want to be professional. Don't send emails that are full of grammatical and spelling errors. Don't leave voicemails where you just ramble. It's a good idea if you're making a phone call to follow up or for any other communication to plan out what you want to say ahead of time so that you stay on message and you don't sound like you're confused. Next, we'll talk about how to use references. You might notice on the resumes in our book that the student examples show that references are available upon request. In other words, they don't provide the references right in the resume itself, but they say that the references are available upon request. In other words, the employer will get the references when the employer asks for them or decides it's time to take the next step. When I've talked with different employers and people who look through resumes, there isn't really one overall agreement on whether references should be included or not. Now, often if you fill out an application online or a paper application, the employer will straight up ask for some references, and you'll definitely want to include those if they're asked for. But sometimes the employer doesn't really care about them in a resume because, maybe 100 resumes will come in for a few positions, and the interviewer or the company will only really check on a few of those references later on anyway, and so it's just extra information that's coming through. They don't really need it, they don't really care about it. Other employers do say that they want those references right off the bat. In your resume for this class, you can just say references available upon request. When you actually go to apply for a job, I would ask the hiring committee or the human resources committee or look on the website to see if references are required right away. Either way, at some point you're going to need references, and you want to be really careful about this. You don't want to just randomly add people who you think might be good references. In general, you want to sort of plan it out. You want to craft it. Ideally, you'll have one or two really good professional references. That means people who have been your bosses before, possibly coworkers before. You'll want people with responsible positions, not just the kid who was slinging fries next to you at McDonald's, but your supervisor or the person who was a manager at that particular franchise. In this case, for professional references, you do want to make sure that that person you want as your professional reference is still working at the place where you are working. If that person isn't still working there, that's fine, but you want to give the most current up-to-date contact information possible. You also want to check with references whenever you're going to use a person for a reference, make sure that's okay. You want to try to use references that will relate the most to this particular job, or maybe you're in the particular field. In addition to professional references, especially those of you who are younger and may not have had many jobs in the past, it's good to provide some other references, people who can talk about your character or especially the skills that you're trying to highlight in your resume and in your cover letter. So this can include some of your current professors or even teachers that you've had in the past. If you're 18, then maybe somebody who was a teacher in your high school when you were a senior would be appropriate. But again, once you get into your 20s, the employers are going to care a lot less about high school. They're going to want more current references. You probably want to avoid relatives as references. Sometimes I know that's the first thing that comes into your mind is have your dad or mom write a reference letter for you or your uncle. And I would only do that if that person is very directly related to that field or works for that particular company. But you want to avoid what's called nepotism. In other words, acting like you're entitled to a position simply because you're related to somebody that the employer might know. So you want to be very, very careful and generally avoid that. Sometimes job applicants, especially younger students, automatically will list, for example, their pastors or their preachers or their youth pastors as personal references as well. And I tend to discourage that for the most part because those people aren't really seeing you with the skills that are needed for that job. They're seeing you within a very particular setting. They're seeing you within a religious context. The employer may or may not really value that. But even if the employer does value that, or the hiring committee or the human resources person, even if those people do value the religious experience, they're not necessarily going to be able to talk to the reference about the skills that are needed for that job. The exception to this might be if someone in a religious or other setting has seen very specific skills that will be useful for the job. So, for example, if you and your youth group went on a trip to help build houses and you took up a leadership position, you did a great job building the houses, you were able to really get some things done and showed some skills for leadership or showed some skills for building houses, and you're applying for a job that would make use of those skills, then fine, that might be something that a very particular reference it would help with. In general, though, you're going to want to avoid references that will just say, oh, yeah, that person is a good person. He seemed pretty nice. He went to church. Things that aren't directly related to the job. In some cases, jobs or sometimes the scholarships you're applying for or other things will ask for letters of reference. And this can be more common with some jobs than with others, and jobs with more responsibility will often want letters of reference rather than relying on your human resources person to call somebody up and just ask a few questions. So, if you're needing a letter of reference, you definitely want to approach someone as early in the process as possible. You want to give that reference writer as much time as possible. You also want to talk with that person about what sort of skills or experiences you would like that person to highlight. And you don't want to come across as telling that person what to write, but just say, hey, this is what I'm trying to highlight in my own cover letter. This is what the job entails. This is what I'd like to get across, and here might be something to think about. You also shouldn't just assume that someone will write a letter of reference. I've had a number of students ask me to write letters of reference for them for whether it's jobs or scholarships, etc. And I love doing that. I'm always happy to do that. And most of your professors will be happy to do that. But if you barely put an effort into a class and you just barely passed and you didn't really do anything in the class that showed any good characteristics, then you probably aren't going to want to ask that professor for a letter of reference. Again, with letters of reference, like with so many other things, you want to make sure that you're following directions. Sometimes the employer wants you to gather the letters of reference together into one packet and send it in. Other times they'll have a place or a specific person to whom the letters of reference should be submitted. So make sure you're paying attention and following directions with those. Once you've written that brilliant resume and cover letter and you're sending it in to get the job, the next piece is follow-up. You need to be careful to not cross the line between taking initiative and being annoying. In general, prospective employers do expect that once a job seeker has sent in a resume and cover letter, then that job seeker is going to follow up and check to make sure it arrived okay, see if there were any questions, and check to see what the next step in the process will be. And you should do all of those things. You want to make sure that the resume was in the proper format and that the right person was able to get the resume so far, and to make sure that you do understand what happens next in the process. And you want to ask about how long it will be before you hear back from the employer. Once you have that information, though, you don't want to be calling back every day and bothering people about it, because they will make note of that, whether it's the boss's secretary or the human resources secretary or the people you're asking directly. They may not respond to your emails. They may get annoyed and tired of you asking about it constantly. So once you've gotten the answer about when you'll hear back and how long it will be, then I would make a note of that, keep a file, and on that day that you're supposed to hear back, or if they've told you 3 to 5 days, you want to call back after that period of time just to follow up to check and see. As much as possible, you'll want to get very direct, very specific, and precise timeline answers to find out when you should be checking in rather than just annoying someone. Now, the secretary or the human resources may not always have that answer for you, but it's good to at least ask. My advice is to just be very upfront and ask the person who you're working with there, whether it's, again, secretary or a human resources coordinator, how long you should wait and when you should ask about the next step. Usually this person has been through it a million times and will give you pretty straight up answers, and that'll be that. Remember that even though probably for you that getting this job is a very high priority, and this is something that you're probably thinking about quite a bit, for that employer or for that human resources person, your resume is just one of many, and maybe even this job is just one of several things that person is working on from time to time. So this is not going to be as high a priority for them as it is for you. So you do want to follow up. Just don't be annoying about it. While you're in the following up process, if you think that you have a good chance of getting called in for an interview, then you do want to start doing more research about the company, find out more about the company's goals, their history, even some of the people you might be working with, what their priorities are. You want to find all of this out so that you're prepared. So sometimes if they call you in for an interview, it might be very sudden. You may not have days and days to prepare. So you want to have that packet, that file already in front of you so that if they do call you in for an interview or have a phone interview, you're ready to go as soon as possible.